You probably hated going to school as a kid, but believe it or not, for almost all of human history, school didn't even exist. If you had been born 100,000 years ago, nobody would have asked how your first day at school went because there were no classrooms, no teachers, and no books. So how did children learn? They learned by following the adults around them every single day. And instead of sitting at a desk, they spent their time watching people hunt, gather food, make stone tools, build shelters, and start fires. As they grew older, they slowly began helping with these jobs until one day they could do them on their own. Every lesson had a purpose because life was much harder than it is today. Children had to learn where to find clean water, which plants were safe to eat, how to avoid dangerous animals, and how to work together with the rest of their group. These weren't skills for passing an exam. They were skills for staying alive. For thousands and thousands of years, this was the only education humans needed. But then something happened that changed everything. Instead of moving from place to place looking for food, people began settling in one location, and that simple decision would completely change the future of learning. Everything changed around 10,000 years ago when humans discovered farming. Instead of following animals from place to place, people began growing their own food and building permanent villages. For the first time, children grew up in one home instead of constantly moving with their families. Life became very different. Some children helped plant crops, while others looked after animals or carried water from nearby rivers. As villages became larger, people no longer had to do the same jobs. Some became builders, some made pottery, some worked with metal, and others became traders. Children started learning these skills from an early age because one day they would continue the same work as their parents. As more villages turned into towns, life became more organized. People began trading with one another, storing food, collecting taxes, and keeping track of supplies. But there was one problem. Very few people knew how to read or write. Without written records, it became harder to manage growing communities. Someone had to count, record, and organize everything. That simple problem led to an idea that would change history forever. People began creating places where children could learn skills that couldn't be taught just by watching their parents. The first real schools were about to appear. The world's first schools appeared about 5,000 years ago in a place called Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq. But these schools weren't built for every child. Only a small number of children, usually from wealthy or powerful families, were allowed to attend. The reason was simple. Reading and writing had become incredibly valuable. Kings needed people to record laws, merchants needed someone to keep track of trade, and temples needed records of food, land, and money. These people were called scribes, and becoming one was one of the most respected jobs at the time. School wasn't easy. Students spent hours learning hundreds of symbols instead of the alphabet we use today. They pressed those symbols into soft clay tablets using a small reed stick. Every lesson demanded patience because one mistake could ruin an entire tablet. Teachers expected students to practice the same symbols over and over again until they could remember them perfectly. It took years before someone became skilled enough to work as a scribe. While a few children were sitting in these early classrooms, millions of others were still learning the old way by farming, hunting, building, or helping their families at home. For the first time in history, education had split into two paths. One path prepared children for everyday life. The other prepared them to read, write, and help run entire civilizations. And as more civilizations appeared, schools began to change in ways nobody had seen before. If you walked into one of the first schools, you probably wouldn't recognize it. There were no colorful classrooms, no school bells, and no lockers filled with books. The students often sat on the floor or on simple benches while the teacher stood nearby giving instructions. Lessons started early and could last for hours. Most of the day was spent reading, writing, and copying symbols again and again. There were no printed textbooks, so students had to write almost everything themselves. It was slow, repetitive work, but it was the only way to remember what they had learned. Teachers were also much stricter than many teachers today. If a student refused to listen or didn't complete their work, punishment was common. In many ancient schools, being hit with a stick or cane was considered a normal way to keep discipline. Children were expected to obey without arguing because respect for the teacher was seen as just as important as learning. Even with these harsh rules, families who could afford an education believed it was worth it. A child who learned to read and write had opportunities that most people could only dream of. They could work for kings, help run governments, keep important records, or become trusted advisors in powerful cities. For many students, school wasn't just a place to learn. It was a chance to build a completely different future. But education didn't stay the same forever. As new civilizations grew, they began teaching far more than just reading and writing. Children started learning skills that would shape the world for thousands of years. As time passed, education became much more than learning how to read and write. In ancient Egypt, some students learned mathematics, medicine, and engineering because those skills were needed to build temples, monuments, and manage the kingdom. In ancient Greece, people believed education should train both the mind and the body. Students didn't just study numbers and language, they also learned music, sports, philosophy, and public speaking. The goal was to help them become confident thinkers and good citizens. The Romans later built on many of these ideas. They taught reading, writing, grammar, history, and law because they believed these subjects prepared young people for leadership in public life. Even then, education wasn't the same for everyone. Many children still spent their days helping their families instead of attending school. Whether a child received a formal education often depended on their family's money, their social status, and where they lived. Today, millions of children wake up every morning, put on a school uniform, grab a backpack, and head to class without giving it much thought. But that simple routine is the result of thousands of years of change. Over time, those small schools grew into colleges, universities, and the education systems we know today. Even though classrooms look very different now, one thing has never changed. Every generation teaches the next generation. So the next time you think school is boring, remember this. Thousands of years ago, most children would never have had the chance to sit in a classroom at all. If you could spend one day as a student in the ancient world, would you do it? Let me know your answer in the comments. And if you enjoy learning how people lived long before the modern world, subscribe to Chaos Drawn.